The clink of silver on porcelain was the only music Maya Washington heard. It was a delicate, expensive sound that set the rhythm for her life inside Celeste, a restaurant where the sauces were called Jus and the water was flown in from a Fijian spring. She moved between the tables with an economy of motion learned over 2 years of balancing trays laden with seared scallops and $40 salads. Her feet ached in her sensible black flats, a dull throb that was as much a part of the job as the polite, detached smile she wore like a uniform. The evening rush was cresting. A tide of low conversation and the scent of truffle oil filled the air. Maya was in her element, a calm center in a storm of hushed demands and subtle gestures. She refilled a wine glass without being asked, cleared a finished plate with a ghost-like touch, and anticipated a request for the check with the precision of a psychic. This was her world, controlled, predictable, a series of small, manageable tasks that added up to a paycheck. Then the rhythm broke. The hostess, a young woman named Chloe whose composure was as fragile as the restaurant's crystal, approached Maya's station, her face pale. "Maya, I don't know what to do," she whispered, twisting the strap of her apron. Line 2. "He's asking for Mr. Alistair, but Mr. Alistair is dealing with the broken freezer, and this man, he's not happy." Maya glanced toward the back. Mr. Alistair, a man who believed panic was a failure of management, was indeed engaged in a heated, whispered argument with a maintenance worker. He wouldn't be available for at least 10 minutes. "I'll take it," Maya said, wiping her hands on her own apron. Dealing with difficult customers was a specialty of hers. The key was to remain unbreakably calm, a wall of professional courtesy they could dash themselves against until they tired. She picked up the receiver at the hostess stand. "Celeste, Maya speaking. How may I help you?" The silence on the other end was heavy, charged. Then a voice, low and resonant as a cello string, cut through the line. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. "The corner booth by the window. I require it in 10 minutes.
No hello.
No please. Just a command." Maya's professional smile tightened. She pictured the booth in question, table 12, with its panoramic view of the city lights, booked solid for the next 6 months. "I'm sorry, sir, but that table is reserved this evening. In fact, it's booked for the foreseeable future." "That is not my concern," the voice said, the calm in it more menacing than any shout. "It is now your concern. Make it available." A flicker of annoyance sparked in Maya's chest, hot and sharp. She had spent 9 hours on her feet, placating egos and serving overpriced food to people who looked right through her. She was tired. "Sir, as I said, the table is unavailable. We have a cancellation list, but it's quite long. Perhaps if you had called earlier." "Do you know who you are speaking to?" The question was laced with a cold, dangerous arrogance. And that was it. The spark of annoyance became a flame. Maya thought of her tuition bills, of the double shift she'd picked up, of the sheer exhaustion that settled deep in her bones. She was done being a wall. "Someone who needs a lesson in manners," she said, her voice clear and steady. Then she hung up. The click of the receiver dropping into its cradle was the loudest sound in the world. Chloe stared at her, her mouth a perfect O of horror. You just hung up on him. He was rude," Maya said, a sliver of satisfaction cutting through her exhaustion. Mr. Alistair chose that moment to reappear, his face flushed from the freezer argument. What was the issue on line 2? "Some guy demanding table 12, Maya reported, already turning her attention back to her section. Mr. Alistair's flush vanished, replaced by a ghastly pallor. "Maya, what exactly did you say?" "I told him it was booked, and then I told him he was rude, and hung up." He looked as if she'd just confessed to setting fire to the kitchen. He grabbed the hostess log, his hands trembling slightly as he pointed to a note scribbled at the top of the page. "Line 2, priority Kwon Jihan." "That line, Maya," he said, his voice a strangled whisper, "is the personal, unlisted number for Mr. Kwon." The name meant nothing to Maya. It was just a name. But the fear in her manager's eyes told her it should. Before she could ask, the serene atmosphere of Celeste shattered. A low, Powerful car. A black sedan so polished it looked like a shard of obsidian, slid to a silent stop at the curb. It wasn't a car that parked, it was a car that arrived. The valet, a kid named Leo who had a swagger for every Porsche and Ferrari that pulled up, simply froze, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The back door opened. A man in a tailored suit of charcoal gray stepped out. He was followed by another and then a third. They moved with a synchronized, predatory grace, their eyes scanning the street, the restaurant, the world. Then the final man emerged from the car. He was tall, with broad shoulders that strained the impeccable cut of his Tom Ford suit. His hair was black, styled with a precision that suggested it wouldn't dare move in a hurricane. He didn't look around. He didn't need to. He moved as if the space around him was his by right, the air parting to let him through. His gaze fixed on the glass doors of the restaurant, and through them, his eyes found Maya. The entire dining room seemed to hold its breath. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Conversations died. Mr. Alistair looked like he was about to faint. Kwon Jihan walked into the restaurant, his 3 guards fanning out behind him, silent and imposing. The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. He ignored the panicked apologies that began to babble from Mr. Alistair. He walked directly toward the hostess stand, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. He stopped a foot from Maya. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He was flawlessly handsome in a way that was almost inhuman, his features sharp and defined, as if carved from stone. But it was his eyes that held her captive. They were dark, bottomless, and utterly devoid of warmth. They held the cold certainty of a man who had never been told no in his life. He smelled of cedar and something else, something like smoke and cold steel. His voice, when he finally spoke, was the same one from the phone, but stripped of the distortion, it was quieter, deeper, and 100 times more lethal. "You have my attention," Kwon Jihan said, his eyes never leaving hers. "Now, I will have yours." The words hung in the air, a promise and a threat. Before Maya could form a reply, a screech of tires from the street outside sliced through the silence. It was followed by a percussive series of pops, a sound she vaguely recognized from movies but had never heard in real life. Gunshots. The grand window of Celeste, the one that overlooked the glittering city, exploded inward in a shower of crystallized glass. Screams erupted. Chaos bloomed. Jihan's men moved with terrifying speed. They were no longer just imposing figures in suits, they were soldiers. One of them, the largest, grabbed Maya's arm, his grip like a steel vise, and yanked her down behind the solid oak of the hostess stand. Kwon Jihan was already there, moving not with panic but with a chilling, deliberate calm. He crouched beside her, his body a solid shield between her and the broken window. The space was impossibly small. Her cheek was pressed against the rough wool of his suit jacket, the scent of him overwhelming her senses. The gunfire was a brutal, staccato rhythm. More glass shattered. A woman shrieked in pain. Through it all, Jihan was a statue of composure. He murmured something in Korean to his man, his voice a low, guttural command. Maya didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Absolute authority in the face of death. He was not a victim of the violence, he was a participant. This was his language. Pressed against him, she could feel the hard lines of his body, the coiled tension in his muscles. He was a predator brought to bay, and the air around him crackled with a dangerous energy. The attack ended as quickly as it began. The sound of a car speeding away replaced the gunfire, leaving behind a ringing silence broken by sobs and the crunch of glass underfoot. For a moment no one moved. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the steady, unhurried beat of Jihan's. He had not flinched. His breathing was even. One of his men, younger than the others, with a sharp, intelligent face, crept to the window and peered out. He spoke again in Korean. Jihan's reply was short, decisive. He shifted, and the movement finally broke the spell. He was so close. Too close. Maya pushed back, needing space, needing air. He let her move, his dark eyes assessing her with an unnerving intensity. He was looking for cracks for weakness. She refused to give him any. She met his gaze, her fear a cold knot in her stomach, but her expression was pure defiance. The sharp-faced man, who Jihan called Minjun, came to his side. "The chas," he said in perfect, unaccented English. It had to be. This was a message. Jihan's jaw tightened. He looked from Minjun back to Maya. His stare was heavy, analytical. It was the look of a man solving a complex and unpleasant equation. She was part of that equation now. He rose to his feet in one fluid motion, brushing a piece of glass from his sleeve as if it were a speck of lint. The chaos of the restaurant seemed to fade into the background, the entire universe shrinking to the space between them. He extended a hand to her. It was not a polite offer of assistance. It was a command. She ignored it, pushing herself up on her own shaky legs. "You're coming with me," he stated. It wasn't a question. "The hell I am," she shot back, her voice raspy. "The police are on their way. I'm staying here." A flicker of something, not amusement, something colder, passed through his eyes. "They saw me walk to you," he said, his voice dropping low so only she could hear. "They saw my interest. In their eyes, you are now connected to me. To them, you are a loose end. To me," he paused, his gaze sweeping over her, "you are a witness who hung up the phone on me. Either way, staying here is a death sentence. The police cannot protect you from people like that." He was right. The cold, brutal logic of his words settled over her like a shroud. She looked past him at Mr. Alistair, who was huddled with the other staff, his face ashen. He wouldn't meet her eyes. In that moment, she was utterly alone. She was no longer Maya Washington, waitress. She was a liability. An anomaly. She had two choices: a world she understood that could no longer protect her, or a world she couldn't comprehend that was offering a lethal, terrifying form of sanctuary. She made a choice born of survival, not desire. She gave a single, sharp nod. Satisfaction, cold and brief, touched his lips. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm but not painful, and pulled her toward the back of the restaurant. "Minjun, handle this," he ordered over his shoulder. No one saw anything. They moved through the chaotic kitchen, the chefs and dishwashers flattening themselves against the stainless steel counters to let them pass. He pushed open the heavy steel door to the back alley, and the cool night air hit her face. The stench of garbage and stale grease was a stark contrast to the perfumed air of Celeste. The black sedan was waiting, its engine a low, throbbing hum. He bundled her into the back seat and slid in beside her. The door closed with a solid, final thud, sealing them inside a world of silent, conditioned air and buttery leather. The car pulled away from the curb with impossible smoothness, leaving the sirens and the screaming behind. They drove in absolute silence. Maya stared out the tinted window at the blurred lights of the city she thought she knew. It looked alien now, a place full of unseen dangers. She was acutely aware of Jihan beside her. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring straight ahead, his profile stern and unreadable. But she could feel the heat of him, the sheer physical presence of him filling the space. The car descended into a private underground garage and came to a stop in a reserved spot. A private elevator opened directly into a penthouse apartment that was less a home and more a monument to wealth and isolation. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking 180-degree view of Los Angeles. The furniture was minimalist, expensive, and cold. It was the most beautiful prison she had ever seen. Jihan's other two men followed them in, then took up positions by the door, silent sentinels. He walked to the window, his back to her. "Minjun will arrange for your things to be collected," he said to the glass. "You will stay here. For how long?" Maya asked, her voice stronger than she felt. "For as long as it takes," he turned around, his hands in his pockets. The posture should have been casual, but on him, it was coiled, watchful. "What is your name?" "Maya." He tasted the name, saying it under his breath. Maya, the sound of her name in his mouth was different. It felt possessive, a claim. He crossed the room in a few silent strides, stopping in front of her. His eyes dropped to her face. "You have glass on your cheek," he said, his voice flat. Before she could react, he lifted his hand. His fingers were long and elegant, a musician's hands, but she knew they were capable of incredible violence. He brushed his thumb over her cheekbone, his touch shockingly gentle as he dislodged a tiny, glittering splinter of glass. Her breath caught in her throat. For a fraction of a second, his thumb lingered, the calloused pad of it a warm, rough pressure against her skin. It was a small, almost deniable moment of tenderness in a sea of brutality. He pulled his hand back quickly, as if her skin had burned him. He turned away again, breaking the connection, his expression shuddered once more. "Carelessness gets people killed," he said, his voice hard, directed at the window and the city beyond. "I learned that lesson once. I was supposed to protect someone, my partner. She was brilliant, fearless. But I miscalculated. I underestimated an enemy." He paused, and the silence was filled with a grief so old and cold it chilled the air. "She paid the price for my mistake. I will not make that mistake again." He did not look at her as he said it. He was speaking to a ghost. In that moment, Maya saw the first real crack in his armor. The coldness wasn't just a part of his nature. It was a fortress he had built around a wound, a failure he could never forgive himself for. And now, against her will, she was inside that fortress with him. The realization was more terrifying than any bullet. The days that followed blurred into a strange, tense routine. Maya was a ghost in his gilded cage. She had access to a vast library, a closet full of clothes that appeared overnight in her size, and meals prepared by a silent chef who came and went like an apparition. But the doors were locked. The windows did not open. Jihan was a constant, brooding presence. He spent most of his time in his office, a room she was not permitted to enter, taking calls in low, clipped Korean. She watched him. She learned the way he held his shoulders when he was angry, the subtle tightening of his jaw when a deal was going sour. She learned that he drank his coffee black and that he never, ever seemed to sleep. The tension between them was a living thing, a constant hum in the sterile air of the penthouse. It was a war of silence, of proximity, of unspoken things. One night, the oppressive quiet of the apartment became too much. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach. She found herself wandering, a restless spirit in the dark. She paused outside his office. The door was ajar, a sliver of light spilling into the hallway. Drawn by a force she didn't understand, she pushed it open. He wasn't there. A single lamp cast a golden glow over his massive desk. It was covered in files and documents. One file was open, its contents stark under the light. It was about the Cho family, his rivals. Her feet moved on their own, carrying her closer. She saw surveillance photos, charts of their organization, lists of their assets. And then she saw a name that made the blood freeze in her veins. Marco Reyes. She knew that name. She knew that face in the grainy photograph. He was a low-level dealer from her old neighborhood, a man with more ambition than brains who had tried to recruit her older brother into his pathetic crew years ago. She hadn't seen him in years, assuming he had ended up in jail or worse. But here he was, a footnote in a war between kings. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a face she recognized, a history that brushed against her own. "Find what you were looking for." Jihan's voice came from the doorway. He was leaning against the frame, watching her, his expression unreadable. She hadn't heard him approach. Her heart leaped into her throat. She could lie. She could feign ignorance, retreat back into the role of the innocent bystander. But she was tired of being a bystander. She looked from the photo back to him. "I know him," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "His name is Marco. He used to live near my family. He's a nobody, a street-level thug. He shouldn't be involved in any of this." Jihan's eyes narrowed. He walked slowly to the desk and looked down at the file, then back at her. "He is involved now." He studied her face, his gaze sharp enough to peel back layers of her soul. "Tell me about him." By telling him the truth, she was crossing a line. She was no longer just his prisoner, she was becoming his asset. An informant, an accomplice. She was choosing a side. She told him everything she knew about Marco's vanity, his weakness for a particular brand of whiskey, the way he always bragged about his connections. Every word she spoke was a brick in the wall separating her from her old life. Her information gave Jihan an advantage. He began planning a countermove, a precise, surgical strike aimed at Marco, designed to cripple the Chos operations in that sector. But there was a leak, a betrayal from someone deep inside his own organization. Maya overheard it one afternoon, a heated exchange in Korean between Jihan and Minjun from behind the closed office door. She couldn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. Minjun was pleading, urgent. Jihan's replies were clipped, final. When he emerged, he was putting on his jacket. He was going out. "It's a trap," she said, blocking his path to the door. "You know it is." He didn't seem surprised that she knew. He simply looked down at her, his face a mask of stone. Loyalty is paid in blood. Betrayal requires the same. He was going to walk into it knowingly, to draw out the traitor. He was willing to be the bait in his own trap. A cold dread, sharp and unfamiliar, seized her. It wasn't just fear for her own situation. It was fear for him. "Don't go," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. He stopped, his hand on the door. He turned back slowly, and for the first time, the mask of the unfeeling crime lord cracked. The man underneath was visible, raw and weary. "In my world," he said, his voice low, stripped of all artifice, "fear is a currency. Everyone is afraid of me, or of what I can do to them. It's a tool. But for the last week, watching you, you look at me and you are not afraid. You are angry. You are defiant." He took a step closer. "It is the most honest thing I have felt in a decade." It wasn't a declaration of love. It was something far more dangerous. It was a confession of her effect on him, an admission that she had breached his defenses in a way no bullet ever could. He left. The hours that followed were the longest of Maya's life. She paced the length of the penthouse, the silence pressing in on her. He returned just before dawn, moving with a stiff, pained grace. There was a darkness in his eyes she hadn't seen before. The trap had been sprung. He had survived. The traitor had been dealt with. But the war had changed. Minjun burst, and an hour later, his usual calm shattered. He didn't even acknowledge Maya's presence. "Boss," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "The Chos. They sent a message." He held up a phone. On the screen was a picture. It was a photo of the apartment building Maya used to live in. Her building. They know who she is. They know her name. The threat was no longer collateral. It was personal. She was the target. Jihan's new, undeniable vulnerability. The Chos offered a trade, the girl for a permanent truce and control of the downtown ports. It was an impossible choice. To give in would be to show weakness, an invitation for every rival to tear his empire apart. To refuse was to sign her death warrant. While Jihan and his men strategized, planning for a war they might not win, Maya felt a cold calm settle over her. She would not be a pawn. She would not be a victim to be traded or avenged. She thought about Marco Reyes. She thought about his arrogance, his predictable patterns. She knew him in a way these men with their surveillance and their informants never could. She knew the neighborhood, the culture, the unwritten rules. She found Minjun alone in the kitchen. She laid out a plan, her voice even and clear. A way to use Marco's history against him, to lure him out not with threats of violence, but with the promise of something he wanted more than money, respect from the old neighborhood. A lie only she could sell. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble that would put her directly in the line of fire. Minjun stared at her. Then he took her plan to Jihan. Jihan's rage was a cold, silent thing. He was furious that she had gone behind his back, that she would even consider putting herself at such risk. But as he listened, she saw the fury in his eyes give way to a grudging respect. He saw the brutal, simple genius of it. It was a move he would never have thought of, because it came from a world he didn't understand. Her world. They used her plan. Maya was the bait. She met Marco in a small, quiet park on the edge of her old territory, a place he felt safe. She could feel Jihan's men, invisible in the periphery. For a few terrifying minutes, she thought it would fail. Marco was paranoid, jumpy. But she talked to him, not as a gangster's woman, but as the girl from down the block, speaking his language, stroking his ego, reminding him of a time before all this. She saw his guard drop, just for a second. It was all they needed. It was over in silence.
No gunshots.
Just a few figures emerging from the shadows. Marco was gone. The threat was neutralized. Later, back in the penthouse, the adrenaline faded, leaving an echoing quiet. The city lights glittered below, a kingdom of glass and steel. Jihan stood before her, the cold mask back in place, but his eyes were different.
They saw her now.
Truly saw her. "You should have been terrified," he said. "I was," she answered, her voice steady. "But I was more afraid of being your victim." He closed the distance between them, his gaze intense. "You are not my victim," he said, the words heavy with unspoken meaning. "An empire is not held by a king alone." He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress or a witness, but as a force of nature equal to his own. "It requires a queen." It was not a proposal. It was an acknowledgement, a coronation. Her old life was gone, burned away in the fire of the last week. She could never go back to worrying about tips and tuition. The cost of her survival was her innocence. The cost of his was the solitude he had wrapped around himself like a shroud. He had let someone in. He didn't ask her to stay. He didn't have to. He simply held out his hand. Maya looked at his outstretched hand, then into his dark, searching eyes. Taking it wasn't a surrender.
It was a choice.
A choice to step out of the world she knew and into a life of danger, power, and the terrifying, magnetic gravity of the man who ruled it. She lifted her own hand and laid it in his. His fingers closed around hers, a firm, possessive grip. It was not an ending. It was an agreement, a claim made and accepted in the silent language they now both understood. She was no longer just the waitress who hung up on the wrong man. She was the woman who had looked into the heart of the abyss and had not flinched. And the abyss had looked back and recognized her as its own.